Now, when I was young, there was a show on TV called Siskel and Ebert, which consisted entirely of two guys just sitting down and reviewing the latest movies, and when their brief discussion on each movie was over, they'd either give it a thumbs up or thumbs down and then move on to the next one. And other than newspapers, magazines, or maybe a segment on your local news or some other type of entertainment show on TV, that was about the only place to get movie reviews from back then. Outside, of course, from just word of mouth, which more often than not was the most relevant to you because it usually came from someone who actually knew you and what you might actually like. And then they gave you their completely unfiltered and unbiased thoughts or opinion before telling you if they thought you should consider going and seeing it or not. And when I really stop and think about it, back in the day I can't recall ever being swayed by a critic review one way or the other. I don't ever remember seeing or reading a professional review and thinking, yeah, now I'm going to go see that movie, or thinking maybe now I'm not going to go and see that. However, I can clearly remember many times, and it still happens to this very day, when a friend suggests a movie that I had no intentions on seeing, or at least seeing in theaters, and then I went to it and saw it and thought, well, yeah, this was a great movie and I'm glad they recommended it to me. Nowadays, though, the ability to get or give opinions or reviews on a movie or to even talk about it well before the movie comes out is really just limited by the amount of time you want to devote to it. Thanks to the internet, pretty much every review on any movie from every professional critic across the world can be found and read online. Not to mention, you can watch even more reviews from amateurs like myself here on YouTube, or take to any number of other social media platforms and ceaselessly talk about whatever film you'd like to, past, present, or even future. We also have websites like Rotten Tomatoes or Metacritic and many others that can compile all these different reviews from all these different sources and then spit out a number that tells us what the general consensus on a movie is from both critics and the general audience, and then give it a final score and seemingly a definitive and indisputable answer to the question, is it a good movie? And on the surface, that all sounds great. It sounds like we have an unlimited number of tools at our disposal to determine whether or not we want to pay good money to see a film in the theater. And if you're perhaps someone with a family of 5 going to a movie these days, that could cost you in the neighborhood of $100 after buying tickets, snacks, and drinks. And no one wants to pay that type of money to see a bad film. However, as great as something like Rotten Tomatoes sounds in theory, like with almost all well-intended things in this world, you will of course have those who want to exploit the system or use it in a way that it was never really meant to be used. And once movies can be given an aggregate score, which again at face value seems like a good way for people to decide whether or not to see a certain movie, well, the desire by those creating these films to then somehow alter that score in their favor and encourage people to see their film will of course be there. In other words, no doubt some movie studios either do buy or at least seek to buy good ratings from professional reviewers in order to bump up that score. Or maybe they expect, or at least hope for, favorable ratings and reviews in exchange for early screenings or being invited to premiere parties or whatever else it might be. And if you don't give that glowing review after being invited to a party, maybe your invitation to the next big premiere will get lost in the proverbial mail. Now, how much does that all possibly affect the integrity of critics on the whole? Well, who knows for sure, but it's not even what I want to focus on here because it's far from the only potential problem with a system like Rotten Tomatoes or film reviews in general. Because when we look at some, though certainly not all critic reviews for a movie like Captain Marvel, for example, which you likely know had a lot of controversy around it before it ever came out, we can look at some critic reviews and easily enough deduce that they're not just reviewing a movie, but they either have been influenced by outside factors in their reviews, or that they have a personal desire to see the movie be successful, and therefore are not an impartial reviewer. Take, for example, this review from Matt Brunson at Film Frenzy, who said of Captain Marvel, "Ignore those imbecilic men's rights activists, frightened fanboys, and all other insecure man-babies shellacked in misogyny. The truth is that this film is reams of fun and, significantly, no different in quality from past solo superhero flicks produced by Marvel." And if we actually go to the full review and take a look at it, and there will be a link to it in the description below, we first see that he so cleverly titled his review for this movie Captain Marvel, Brie and Crackers, which I can only assume is in reference to Brie Larson's comments about how many white dudes are film critics these days. Anyway, as we dig into his review, we see he says this, and now here's Captain Marvel, whose mere existence has predictably triggered those male mouth breathers who think that having one MCU film out of 22, including the upcoming Avengers Endgame, that focuses exclusively on a female superhero is excessive and overreaching, just as having one MCU film out of the 22 that focused exclusively on a black superhero was outrageous and unfair. And first, what I'd actually love to know is, who out there is saying anything like that, short of a very small and, mind you, very unsupported minority of men? And who's actually giving them the time of day, other than you and others like you who want to push this narrative that so many people are against this movie for the worst of reasons? I mean, in the sentence right before that, you even say, and we already received a wonderful gift in the form of 2017's box office bonanza, Wonder Woman. And my question to you would be, where were all those predictably triggered male mouth breathers for that movie? Because I don't remember any significant controversy around it. Maybe because it was a great movie, and Gal Gadot, who plays Wonder Woman, didn't say anything that might be deemed controversial leading up to it. And yeah, I even checked out your review of Wonder Woman to see if maybe you mentioned the mouth breathers there too, and I guess you kinda did when you left this gem of a remark, which I'm not even going to read, in a movie review of all things, which brings up my second point. How am I supposed to take this, or your review of Captain Marvel, as an unbiased film review when clearly you have a vested interest in movies with female leads being successful? And then why should this review then influence a score on Rotten Tomatoes, which in theory should just be based off the quality of the movie itself? And look, Matt, if you for some reason watch this or hear about it, I have no beef or issue with you personally. None at all. You're probably a cool dude in real life, and I'd happily talk movies with you sometime, even though you probably know far more about movies than I do. Hell, other than the fact that you're a critic for Film Frenzy, I don't know the first thing about you. Well, other than what you said in regards to these two movies. But why would I try to make any sort of final judgment about you and who you really might be as a person based on just how you feel about a couple movies? Not that you or anyone else out there ever makes any sort of final judgment or calls people names based on very little information about them other than what they feel about a movie or two. And maybe the funny part here is that I do agree with you in some respect, that it is sad and pathetic that there are some men out there, and again, it's a small number, and to take them seriously or attack them only emboldens them and provokes them to do more. I mean, I'll get to more on that in a moment. Anyway, it's sad that they exist, and that they would get so upset about a movie that might feature a female lead. And I would hope and honestly expect out of someone deemed to be a professional film critic that you would rise above all the BS and just review the movie and give your honest take on it without worrying about outside factors that really shouldn't hinder your personal enjoyment of a movie. Because I can't help but feel like even if you thought Captain Marvel was indeed a terrible movie, you would have never said as much, and I could be completely wrong. You may have just absolutely panned the movie if you didn't like it. But the impression your review gives me is that you wouldn't have. And again, Matt, no hard feelings, and I apologize for kind of calling you out here. You just happen to be the one review I went with for this video, because there are many, many other professional critics out there who fall into this same type of trap and let their own beliefs seep into the way they review movies, and from my view, that basically destroys your objectivity. And then moving on, there's also the problem of what's actually considered a fresh or rotten review on Rotten Tomatoes. And if we take a look at this review from Kate Sanchez, who said, "By setting Captain Marvel in the 90s, the filmmakers did a disservice to the importance Captain Marvel can play in the larger MCU and instead gave us a forgettable origin movie light." And then she goes on to give the movie a 6 out of 10. And somehow this was considered a fresh review, despite her calling it a forgettable origin movie? How does that work exactly? And again, this is only one example of a review that seems negative, or at least mostly negative, and still gets a fresh rating and bumps up the total score. And so then when we step back and take a look at the bigger picture, and we consider the possibility of critics being potentially bought by the film industry, the fact that at least some critics let personal beliefs or biases factor into their reviews, and that apparently an arbitrary system is in place to deem what reviews are considered fresh or rotten, well, what does the critic score really mean on Rotten Tomatoes? How much stock should we actually put into it? And sure, there are certainly some critics, and hopefully it's the vast majority, that truly do have integrity and seek to just review movies as honestly and as fairly as they possibly can. And while I was browsing through and reading the critic reviews on Rotten Tomatoes for Captain Marvel, indeed, many of the ones I checked out, both positive and negative, did just talk about the movie in a very objective way. Though there was also some who just had to talk about the so-called trolls that tried to sabotage it before it ever came out, or about the greater meaning this movie has in regards to our society, and how important it really is. How important a movie about a woman who gets superpowers from a magical stone and fights aliens really is. And look, I can only imagine how irritating some critics find the current state of movie reviews today, because yeah, today any idiot, myself included, can grab a microphone and become an online film critic, or they can take to their keyboard and write a review in any number of places, including Rotten Tomatoes. And to be honest with you here, and I'm sorry to say this, but I do personally put more stock in the audience score on Rotten Tomatoes than the critic one, which I think is a sentiment shared by a lot of moviegoers these days. Nevertheless, of course the audience score can also be manipulated, and that can happen on both ends, because Rotten Tomatoes can delete reviews that they feel are just coming from trolls trying to review bomb a movie by creating fake accounts. And of course people can indeed create fake accounts and try to review bomb a movie. And yes, it does happen to at least some extent. But here's the thing, it doesn't happen to the vast, vast majority of movies. And if it does happen, it's probably happening for a reason. Now, that doesn't mean I necessarily think it's a good reason, or condone it, or think it's the right thing to do. But if people are willing to take the time out of their day to create fake accounts, or hack a score in some other way, shape, or form, they're probably doing it for a reason and trying to make a point. And sometimes it is a valid point they're trying to make, or they at least feel they're doing it for the right reasons, despite others trying to spin it in a different way. Take Captain Marvel again, for example. We had Brie Larson who made some comments about white men that, go figure, a lot of white men took to be offensive, and they proceeded to defend themselves, and in some cases, attacked her and talked about how they didn't want to see her movie, and then they went to Rotten Tomatoes and bombed the want to see score, not the review score, of the movie. And of course, as there always is, there were some that took these attacks to the extreme and got nasty, which prompted a response from those who supported what Brie was originally saying, or at the very least didn't want to see her get attacked, or thought she was being attacked just because she was a woman, and those men didn't want her to be the lead in a superhero movie of all things. Which no one, again, outside of a tiny, tiny minority of men, was actually saying or even remotely upset about. And this, of course, seemed to ultimately get everyone who had any sort of issue with the movie Captain Marvel condemned as someone who just hates women. And though this is going to sound completely random or totally off topic, but this whole scenario reminds me of Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy, and how one of the themes, at least in the first two movies, is how we create our own worst enemies, which is also a common theme, appropriately enough, in a lot of comic books in general. Because if we just look at those first two movies, in very simple terms, mind you, Batman was created by the mob that had taken control of Gotham City. Because if Bruce Wayne's parents never get killed by one of the mob, he never goes to the extreme and becomes Batman to take them out. And if the mob never creates a Batman, who of course was indeed doing a great job of taking them out, they never have to turn to the Joker to hopefully stop Batman. And you might think that's a silly analogy, but this is kind of happening on a much larger scale in our society. People are pushing each other further and further to opposite extremes. And I believe, at least, that it stems from a failure to actually listen to what others are trying to say on the other side, or to even remotely begin to understand their point of view, and to instead just believe that your opinion has to be both the right one and the only one that can exist. And all too often we resort to absolutely childish things like name-calling, or even worse, when dealing with that other side, which of course just pushes people even further to the other side, or starts to foster in them beliefs that may have never been there in the first place. And it may sound silly, and when you think about it, it really is, but when you start attacking people for maybe not liking or seeing the importance of a superhero movie with a woman in the lead, they might actually eventually start to hate female superhero movies, even though they initially didn't even care one way or the other, or maybe they even liked them initially. And then when you say of those people that, well, they were just suppressing their misogynistic ways all along and now we're exposing their true nature, well, I guess maybe in some cases, but in the majority, I'd have to imagine you're just creating that nature in them now where it didn't exist before. You're hounding them and calling them something to the point where they eventually want to become it just out of spite. And yeah, this does go both ways. I'm not trying to say it doesn't, because when you attack people back for their beliefs, even if you were provoked in the first place, more often than not, you're not going to change their minds in the least. And instead, you're only going to entrench them further in those beliefs, and you're going to make them attack you even more. And somehow we've gotten to the point, now just narrowing my focus back to the film industry here, where people will point to a Rotten Tomatoes score as a victory, as if it means something more than a collection of opinions that, as I discussed earlier, could be influenced by many different factors, when in reality, who honestly cares what the critic consensus is, or the audience consensus is on a movie? If you like it, or it means something to you, so be it, that's great. And if not, who really cares? I mean, I meet people from time to time who tell me they think Star Wars is the dumbest thing ever, and they can't even fathom why I devote so much time, effort, and money to it. And as you probably know, yeah, I do love Star Wars. It's a hobby and an absolute passion of mine that I really don't care if you think is ridiculous, because I can handle the opinions of others that don't align with mine. And talking about Star Wars is the main reason I started this channel and what I still primarily try to do with it. However, in the few years I've been doing this now, I've seen the fandom I love become a war zone, and unlike with the prequels, which also caused a stir in the fan base, shall we say, it's not just about the quality of the movies like it was with them, though, yeah, it is part of it, but it's about everything outside and around it. Somehow Star Wars, of all things, has become a front in the culture war for a lot of people, which is odd and crazy because I don't think there are any real fans out there who want it to be that, which is why they're so upset that it's becoming that, or that it's being forced on them, when all they really want is some good Star Wars to enjoy. Which goes back to what I'm trying to say here overall. Those who are presumably, and to what extent can be debated, trying to push their agenda by using Star Wars, well, they're obviously doing it to bring about some sort of change that, from their point of view, is good or needed or necessary. However, that change is being rejected by many fans who don't want to see Star Wars used for something that they don't think it should be used for. And the thing is, most aren't actually against the message or agenda, which seems to be more female characters in the franchise. They're just fine with it, and actually they're for it. They're just not for the way it's being handled, because it seems to be taking a priority over the quality of the movies. Anyway, by trying to change the Star Wars fandom, if you will, they've created a stir that wasn't there before, and wouldn't have been if they just naturally put more female characters in it without making such a big deal out of it. So again, this is another case of creating your own worst enemy, because there are now many fans out there who are adamantly fighting back against this agenda and would rather see Star Wars burn to the ground than change into something else. But again, it's not necessarily because they disagree with the message or don't want more female characters, but because they don't appreciate the way it's being done. In closing here, as much as I do love talking about movies, and I'll continue to do so of course, I do kind of miss the days when word of mouth was the best and pretty much only means by which we got or heard movie reviews. If I were a bit more tech savvy, maybe I'd make a website like Rotten Tomatoes that ditched the final scores and just let people say what they wanted to say about a movie without in any way censoring them or making people worry about some sort of final score that they might be contributing to. And I'd simply call it word of mouth. Well, that's all I've got for this time, and now it's your turn to weigh in on this topic. Are we just creating our own worst enemies these days, and why or how do you think it's happening? Either way, tell me what you think in the comments below, and let's talk about some movies. And until next time, thanks for watching.